Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Helen Phelan, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, The Promise and Power of Arts-Based Research, with best-selling author and internationally recognized leader in arts-based research, Professor Patricia Leavy. I'd like to let you know that today's webinar will be recorded. There'll be an opportunity for some conversation at the end of the presentation, so please use the Q&A button to add any questions or comments you might have, and we'll get to as many of them as we can within the time that we have today. Our webinar today is co-hosted by PPI Ignite and the PAR Team Research Cluster at the University of Limerick in Ireland. This is the first in a series of online events on participatory and arts-based approaches to research. We are delighted to have the University of Limerick President, Professor Kerstin Mey, to launch our series today and to introduce Professor Leavy's presentation. Just before we commence, I'd like to take this opportunity to say a few words about the work of PPI Ignite and the PAR Team Research Cluster, and to acknowledge those who have made today's event possible. PPI Ignite supports researchers to include the participation of the public and of patients as an integral aspect of health research. We are particularly indebted to Professor Anne McFarlane, who leads the PPI unit here at the university, as well as Una McInerney and Dr. Trina McCafferty for their contribution to today's event. PAR Team is a health research cluster initiative which explores how the arts can contribute to this ethos of inclusion and participation in research. As cluster lead, I work with a team of people from across the university and the wider community, including Dr. Sylvia Murphy-Tighe from the Department of Nursing and Midwifery, Professor Anne McFarlane and Dr. Suzanne Hushka from the School of Medicine, Dr. Hilary Moss and Dr. Trina McCafferty from the Irish World Academy of Music and Dance, and Mr. Ahmed Hassan from our migrant NGO partner, Doris. I'd particularly like to thank today Dr. Fran Gary, our PAR Team postdoctoral research, for all her work in putting this event together, and Surka Hassett for providing our technical support. Within PAR Team, which stands for Participatory and Arts-Based Methods for Involving Migrants in Health Research, we're particularly interested in singing as an arts-based research method, and much of our work is in the context of migration and migrant health. However, arts-based research, of course, embraces all of the arts, and it is a potential research method for anybody who is interested in developing creative and participatory approaches within their research. We are fortunate to have in our university president a scholar with a long track record of advocacy for the arts, and particularly for artistic research. And it is my great pleasure now to ask the University of Limerick President, Professor Kerstin Mey, to launch this series and to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you very much, Helen. Hello, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I'm joining today's webinar, The Promise and Power of Arts-Based Research, and to launch a series of online events for anyone interested in using participatory arts-based approaches in their research. As Professor Helen Phelan has just said, this virtually hosted seminar series builds on the sustained initiatives of practice-based research of the Health Research Institute situated PAR Team Participatory and Arts-Based Methods Involving Migrants in Health Research Cluster and the Public Patient Involvement Ignite initiatives. And it is my privilege to introduce Professor Patricia Leavy, a leading scholar, award-winning author, and advocate for arts-based research. We are very fortunate indeed that Professor Leavy will be sharing her insights and expertise with us today. And I'm sure that today's symposium and the series as a whole will make a lasting impact on the wider context of arts-based research at UL and further afield. Arts-based research at UL can be found in diverse places such as the Irish World Academy of Music and Dance, Allied Health and Health Research, the Department of Policy and Public Administration, the School of Culture and Communications, the School of Design, School of Architecture, arts-based approaches and methods are being made fruitful in the engagement work of creative writing and the National Writing Center, the Regional Writing Center, in the Department of Physical Education, and in many other areas. So before I introduce Professor Leavy more fully, I would like to dwell a moment on arts-based research and the use of arts-based methods in UL, if you allow me. Examples include, for instance, our UL practicum modules, where students work in situ on bespoke and often co-designed projects in, with, and through communities in Limerick and the region to stimulate community participation and co-creation. It has been made fruitful in the diploma course CWEL, Community Wellness, Empowerment, Leadership, and Life Skills, to address community issues in ways that the building of partnership enhances existing strengths, fosters community resilience and leadership, and contributes towards improving quality of life and the creation of healthy and sustainable communities. It also carries modules such as iPlay, which is a weekly physical activity program designed for children, youth, and young people with special needs, which is situated in the Physical Education and Sports Sciences Department in UL. Arts-based methods foster participation and engagement in our work to widen participation in higher education through the Access Office and our arts officer there, who facilitates students through creative endeavor. And these methods are being employed to shape a shared value base in the promotion of education aspirations and achievement, the development of self-confidence, and in fostering a respective community ethos. Building on UL Engage, we have formed a UL Community Engagement Hub and received significant funding from the Higher Education Authority for the UL Method Project to design and implement a community engagement hub. We have become members of the UNESCO-endorsed Global Network Knowledge for Change. The K4C, with its headquarters in the University of Victoria in Canada and co-shared from New Delhi, delivers a global development program for mentors in community engaged learning and research. And many of the methods promoted are arts-based to generate deep insights that go beyond rational cognitive ways of knowing and providing new ways of understanding communities and people's real lived experiences and views to foster engagement in research and co-creation, knowledge exchange, mutual learning, and ultimately lasting impact building. UL is also involved in a partnership project with CREATE, the Irish Creative Partnership Organization in Dublin, and in collaboration with a number of arts organizations to develop a register to look at how collaborative and engaged practices are being evaluated to inform policymaking and funding for collaborative and socially engaged practice that recognizes the often invisible investment of efforts in trust building and relationship creation that underpins art-based research and engagement. There are many initiatives in UL making fruitful arts-based methods for engagement, but also to nurture qualitative research with engagement, participation, and community co-creation at its heart. The Irish University Association initiative Campus Engage has benefited from the UL experience and expertise to shape guidance for community engaged research and respective advocacy to policy makers and funders. So, it is now with huge pleasure to introduce more formally and fully the internationally renowned independent sociologist and best-selling author, Professor Patricia Leavy. Many of you will be familiar with her landmark publications such as Methods Meets Arts, Art-Based Research Practice, now in its 3rd edition, or the authored book Research Design, Quantitative, Qualitative, Mixed Methods, Arts-Based and Community-Based Participatory Research Approaches, and her edited award-winning handbook of arts-based research, which was recognized in the US as best academic book in 2018. That book brings together interdisciplinary leaders in methodology and arts-based research and explores the synergies between artistic and research practices and addresses issues in designing, implementing, evaluating, and publishing arts-based research. And what an achievement to become the best academic book. It's fantastic. Professor Leavy, who was formerly Associate Professor of Sociology, Chair of Sociology and Criminology, and Founding Director of Gender Studies at Stonehill College in Massachusetts, has brought to fruition significant scholarly initiatives, including as co-founder and co-editor-in-chief, establishing the Art and Research International, a transdisciplinary journal. She is a series creator and editor for 10 book series with Oxford University Press, Guilford Press, and Brill Sense, including the groundbreaking social fiction series. And Professor Leavy is also an acclaimed fiction writer. Recently, her novel Film won the 2020 American Fiction Award for Inspirational Fiction. Her novel Spark won the 2019 American Fiction Award for Inspirational Fiction and the 2019 Living Now Book Award for Adventure Fiction. As an advocate of public scholarship, Professor Leavy has published hundreds of blogs and op-eds, is frequently called on by the US national news media, and more than 100 media profile and interview pieces have been written about her pioneering work. Her commitment and career has been recognized by the New England Sociological Association, the American Creativity Association, the American Educational Research Association, the International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry, and the National Art Education Association. In 2016, Mogul, a global women's empowerment network, named her an influencer. In 2018, she was honored by the National Women's Hall of Fame, and SUNY-New Paltz established the Patricia Leavy Award for Art and Social Justice. So, what better scholar on and advocate for the potency of the human experience and the power of art and society to have amongst us today to present on arts-based research. And I'm now delighted to hand over to Professor Leavy.
Thank you so much for that incredible introduction, President May. And I want to thank everybody who's been involved in creating not only today's event, but the series of events that you have planned. And I'm so honored to be here virtually with all of you. So my plan for this presentation, which initially was going to be given in person at the university and is now moved to an online event because of the global pandemic that we're all enmeshed in, my plan for today, thinking that you might be coming from different backgrounds, you might have some experience with arts-based research, and you might not know what arts-based research is at all. So my plan is to introduce arts-based research and to make an invitation to all of you that if you choose to participate, it is available to you. This is something that all of us can participate in. So in order to do this, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background, how I came to arts-based research, what arts-based research is, and I'm going to tell you about my published arts-based research, and then I'm going to give you some examples from healthcare because I know that's of particular interest to many people who might be watching us today. So starting with my background, I guess I would really have to start in childhood to talk about my love for the arts. And I think that this is something that many of us share in common, even if we don't pursue the arts later in life, that during our childhood, we love the arts. And this was certainly the case for me. So I loved visual art, going to art galleries and museums. My mother is a painter, and so I grew up around artists. I took dance classes for 14 years. I've always loved music, and I've always loved films. There was little that I loved more when I was growing up than my father or my parents taking me to a movie, or if I was really lucky, to a play and live theater. So I always loved the arts. However, despite how much I always loved the arts, I never pursued it as a career, and I instead pursued a career in sociology. And so I studied sociology as an undergraduate and then again in graduate school. When I was in graduate school, I had my first teaching experience. And this experience was really pivotal to me into teaching me about the power of the arts in a new way. And so I just want to share this experience briefly. I was in graduate school. I was about 23 years old. And I desperately needed a part-time job because what I was earning as a stipend in graduate school was not enough to live. At the time, I was in Boston, Massachusetts, and it's a very expensive area to live, and it's very tough for graduate students. So I needed a part-time job, and I applied for adjunct teaching positions at local colleges. And I was hired at a local college to teach one course. It was a social problems course, which is sort of like an introduction to sociology. I was nervous, as you can imagine. I had no teaching experience, had never taken a class about teaching, and I was just sort of thrown into it. And the class worked out, and I taught that class. Well, after I taught that class, I wanted to teach more, mostly so I could pay my bills. So the chair of the department called me into his office, and he said, I have something special I want you to do, which I've learned in life sometimes is a good thing and sometimes is a bad sign. And he did want me to do something that was pretty out there. The department I was teaching in at this school was a combined sociology and criminal justice program. And at the time in Massachusetts, there was a new law. It was called the Quinn Bill. And it said that if police officers went back to school and they got an associate's, bachelor's, or master's degree in criminal justice, they would get a significant pay increase. And not only would they have that increase while they were on their job, but it also affected their retirement and how much money they would earn during retirement. So all of a sudden, schools in the Boston area that had a criminal justice program were flooded with police officers who were there to get their degree, but really they were there to make more money at work. So the chair of my department said he wanted me to teach one of these courses to Boston police officers. I was terrified beyond words. I was about 23 years old. It's hard for you to see me right now, but I'm a petite person. I had only this one previous class of teaching experience, and I had heard horror stories about teaching Boston police officers. And I don't know if you've ever seen any Hollywood movies that feature police officers, but they are often filmed in Boston and based on Boston cops. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that they're known to be tough. They're known to be really tough cops. So I was terrified, and I had heard the cops didn't really want to be there. They were just there for the money, and I thought I was not the right person to do it. But the chair of the department said that I had to teach this class if I wanted to keep the job. But if I didn't like it, then the next semester he would give me a traditional class. So because I needed to pay my bills, I agreed to do it. What class did he want me to teach? Research methods, a required class that no student ever wants to take. So now I have to teach research methods to Boston police officers. So I go into the class on the first day after being up all night, sick and terrified. I walk into the class, they're sitting in rows. There's about 40 of them. 39 are men. There was only one woman in the class. And most of them actually had their uniforms on because they had come from work. So to say this was an intimidating group would be a massive understatement. I walk in the room, they all looked at me and they started laughing. And I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? I was so nervous that my hands were sweating so much that I never put them down on the desk because I was afraid I would leave sweat stains and that they would know I was terrified. I decided there and then that the only way to teach this class would be to teach them differently than I had learned research methods. I would have to think about where they were coming from, their experiences, what they'd be comfortable with, what they'd be intimidated by. And ultimately, I ended up bringing art into the class. And I brought art into the class in many different ways. I brought film into the class, short stories into the class. I did a visual art exercise when I wanted to teach them about observations. I took a reprinting of Picasso's famous painting Guernica, which is black and white, as you might know. And I cut it into pieces and put them in groups, and they didn't know what it was. And I had them write everything they observed about it down over a 10-minute period. And then we all got together to talk about observations. But my point is that I kept bringing art into the class, and it was just my instinct to do that in order to communicate with a different kind of group, and then a group that was not traditionally considered a scholarly group. These were traditionally considered blue-collar workers. And the class actually was great. In the end, I loved it. I was nervous all semester, but in the end, I loved it so much that I ended up during graduate school teaching almost 20 classes at that college. About a dozen of those classes were taught to Boston police officers and other non-traditional learners. And I'm very grateful I have that experience because I took from it in the back of my mind that art can get through to people in a way that nothing else can. And that art can be useful to teach in a way that other things aren't always useful. So I finished my degree, I became a sociologist, I got a tenure track teaching job, and I was doing research. And my research focused primarily on studying women's lives, women's relationships, body image issues, eating disorders, dissatisfaction in relationships with family members or peers, gender identity, sexual identity, these kinds of things. And over the course of nearly a decade, I mostly conducted in-depth interview research with women about their lives on these topics. And I learned a lot, and I did what I had been taught to do in graduate school. I wrote peer-reviewed journal articles, and I presented my research in very traditional ways at conferences. And at some point, after doing this for many years, I started to ask myself some serious questions. I started to have doubts about whether or not this research was useful, whether or not this research would ever reach women like those women I had interviewed. And so I asked myself some serious questions. The first question I asked myself is, academic writing, who reads it? And I did a little research, and as you would suspect, academic writing has a highly limited audience, only of our academic peers. And this is for several reasons. There's prohibitive jargon, and it circulates in limited venues. Peer-reviewed journal articles are not accessible to the public. They circulate only in university libraries. They're typically very expensive. They run on subscriptions. So unless you have a library card to a university, you're not going to have reasonable access to them. They're just inaccessible to the public. And I grew up in a household where, while I ultimately got a PhD, my mother came to the United States as a refugee and has only a high school education. And so I was always aware that people come to the world with different life experiences and different backgrounds and different levels of education. And I've always felt that there's an ethical and moral responsibility that everybody should have access to knowledge and information if they want it. So I feel that my mother is as entitled to information and knowledge as I am, regardless of education. And so this didn't sit well with me, that academic peer-reviewed journal articles are only read within the academy. And then I did a little more research and realized that actually they're not even well read within the academy. So academic journal articles in the social sciences, which is what I come from, and in the humanities, typically have an audience of 3 to 8 readers, okay? 3 to 8 readers. And I wish I could see your faces right now to know if you have a reaction to that. But when I learned it, I had a very strong reaction to that. It's actually over 90% of journal articles have an audience of 3 to 8 readers. And those 3 to 8 readers are just like the author of the article. They have a similar education, similar background, and they're probably reading the article to use it for their own research agenda. So academic articles aren't well read in the academy, and they aren't read at all by the public. They're just inaccessible. So this led me to my next question. My first question was, who reads this stuff? My second question is, academic writing, is it any good anyway? And there's a quote I came across by Eric Urson, who is a biologist, and it's my favorite quote. He said, "Hell is sitting on a hot stone reading your own scientific publications." And I think that's pretty spot on, because I can tell you, I would not want to spend all eternity going back and reading my journal articles. And I think many academics feel that way. Academic writing is often stale and dry, and we use formulas and templates. Journal articles usually follow a pretty rigid formula. And they don't really embody the qualities of good writing from a literary standpoint. And the essence of the stories doesn't always come through. In my own research with women, I was learning things I thought many other women would be interested in, but having a couple of block quotes is not necessarily the best way to communicate those messages. So I became frustrated. I became really frustrated with traditional ways of sharing the stories that I had learned, as well as my cumulative insights over the years. And so I started doing research about different ways to do research. And that's what led me to arts-based research. So what is arts-based research? Arts-based research practices are methodological tools that adapt the tenets of the creative arts in order to address research questions in engaged ways. They can be used for data generation, analysis, and/or representation, or as the entire method of inquiry. ABR can be used in any discipline or field of study. And I think there are a few unique things that ABR requires of researchers. ABR requires researchers to think conceptually, symbolically, metaphorically, thematically. Arts-based research requires us to use intuition, creativity, and flexibility. So what art forms can you use if you're doing arts-based research? And arts-based research practices draw on literary, performative, and visual art genres. So really, any art form you can think of can be used in arts-based research. So I have a list of just a few forms to give you examples, but these are just meant as examples. So representational forms might include short stories, novels, novellas, experimental writing forms, graphic novels, comics, poems, parables, collages, paintings, drawings, sculpture, 3D art, quilts, needlework, performance scripts, theatrical performances, dance, film, songs, and musical scores. Or it might be a mixed method form of art. And those are just examples. So some of the strengths of arts-based research for facilitating research goals. 1, sensitively portraying the complexity of lived experience. And this is something I've thought a lot about, because the traditional ways I used to do and represent research, and that I think many academics do and represent research, does not always represent people with their multidimensionality, does not always represent our participants with the complexity that we know as human beings we all have and we all bring to our lives. So sensitively portraying the complexity of lived experience. Another strength of ABR is promoting empathy and reflection. Empathy and reflection. And when I say reflection, I mean both self-reflection and social reflection. So much the way if you go to a movie and just watch a film for enjoyment, it might make you reflect on something in your own life, or it might raise awareness about something that's happening in society. Arts-based research does the same thing. And I think that building empathy is incredibly important, because if we're going to study and try to help the communities in which we're enmeshed, building empathy for people who might have different experiences or different backgrounds than us seems vitally important. Another strength of arts-based research, which particularly interested me as a sociologist, is forging micro-macro connections. So micro meaning our own lived personal biographies, our own life experience, and macro meaning the larger context in which we live our lives. We all live our lives in a larger context. The fact that we're doing this virtually when it was supposed to be a live event because we are all living within a global pandemic is a perfect illustration of how the world in which we live shapes our lives and our life experiences in many different ways. And one of the things arts-based research is useful for is making those micro-macro links explicit, drawing them out, crystallizing them, making them clear. Another strength of ABR is disrupting stereotypes or dominant ideologies. How do we disrupt stereotypes or dominant ideologies? There are many, many different studies which actually show the arts in general are uniquely good at this. For example, there was a study several years ago about what the researchers call subtle racial bias. And I don't love that term, subtle racial bias, but that's the term they used. And they used about, and the study was actually in healthcare. It was about the biases that healthcare professionals might bring to bear when they're diagnosing patients. So nurses, doctors, that sort of thing. Do they see people differently based on race and ethnicity? And do they diagnose people differently even if they hear similar symptoms? And it was really interesting. The research team used about 12 different interventions to try and see what would help get past this subtle racial bias. And the one intervention that worked across the board was visual imagery. So they would show different visual images that represented racial stereotypes, and that is what got through to people. And then they would show counter stereotypical images. So images that buck the stereotype, challenge the stereotype, expose the stereotype. And that's actually what worked the best. So that's just one example of how arts-based research can disrupt dominant ideologies or stereotypes. And then finally, and what I think is probably mostly of interest to the folks that are watching this and to the folks who invited me to give this talk, is that arts-based research can contribute to public scholarship. And more than anything else, this is what drew me to arts-based research. As I told you, I feel that there's an ethical and moral commitment to make research available to the many, not the few, and that our research findings should not just be a line on our CV or resume, but that they should be of some use in the world. And arts-based research can be made available to multiple audiences. And one of the things you can do if you're conducting arts-based research is to try and identify relevant stakeholders. So those audiences that might benefit in some way from your research, and then you try and share your findings with those communities. So before I get into my own research, I did just want to tell you very briefly about the science of art, or the science behind arts-based research. I think that most people know from their own lives that the arts can move you in ways that are different and unique from how other things move you. So for example, if you go to a play or a movie, you might laugh or you might cry during that experience. You're very unlikely to cry when somebody's reading a lecture. I mean, you might feel like your ears are bleeding because you might be so bored, but you're unlikely to have a true emotional response to that kind of thing, or to an op-ed you're reading, or anything in sort of traditional prose. But if you go to a film or a play and you are moved by it, you might have an emotional response, and you might carry it with you. You might be thinking about that movie that night, the next day, a week later. You might think of it 5 years later. The same is a novel that you read that's meaningful to you, a piece of art that jarred you into thinking about something differently. So I think that most of us know in our personal lives that the arts do impact us in a way that is different than how other things impact us. That being said, there actually is some science behind this, and so I do like to share just a smidgen of that. Neuroscientists have done a lot of research about how people experience art, and how we experience art differently than we experience other things like nonfiction prose. And actually about 4 or 5 years ago, I had an incredible experience. I was invited to the Salzburg Global Seminar in Austria, which is a renowned seminar that's been around since 1947, and they curate different groups that they bring over the years to talk about different topics. And I was invited for a seminar on the neuroscience of art. And it was absolutely fascinating spending a week in Salzburg with this group. I was one of 50 people. About half of the folks there were neuroscientists, and about half were artists. And then there were a few sort of academic types, such as myself. But most of the people there were either neuroscientists or artists. And we saw and heard about amazing research they've conducted doing things like MRI scans when people are listening to music, or people are creating music, when they're reading poetry, when they're creating poetry, and looking at the parts of their brains that have activations that don't when they're reading nonfiction prose or being lectured at, and that sort of thing. So I've experienced this with a range of arts. And I became very interested in a subfield which has been dubbed literary neuroscience. And if you're interested in this, you can easily Google this, and you can actually get a lot of great resources, or there are also resources in my book, Method Meets Art, which the president very nicely mentioned in her introduction. But in Method Meets Art, I talk about this in more depth than I'll be able to today. But in essence, literary neuroscience looks at the impact of fiction on our brains. So what happens to our brains when we're reading literature, when we're experiencing literature? And so I'll just give you a couple of examples. So Natalie Phillips led a team of researchers a few years ago to study what happens to people's brains when they're reading Jane Austen novels. And they did MRI scans when people were reading when the participants were reading Jane Austen novels to see what happens. And the results were really fascinating. It turned out that there were activations in the entire brain while people were reading, and there were activations in parts of the brain that the researchers hadn't expected. So those areas that are associated with touch, for example, which they hadn't realized would be involved with reading. When people were reading the Jane Austen novels, those areas lit up. And the researchers ultimately conclude that that feeling that many of us get when we're really immersed in a novel, it doesn't happen if you're reading everything, but if you're immersed in a novel, if you're enjoying the novel you're reading, there's a feeling like, you know, the house could burn down and you might not notice. I used to argue with my daughter about this all the time. She's 20 now and she's off in college, but when she was younger, she would stay up at night, just one more chapter, because she loved reading. And what was happening to her was actually a physiological process. It's not simply that we enjoy what we're reading, which is a really abstract concept, but there's actually science to support that we really physically feel ourselves immersed in the story we're reading. There was another study published in the journal Brain Connectivity in 2013 by a team of researchers led by a guy named Gregory Burns. And they also studied what happens to our brains when we're reading a novel. And their research is also fascinating. It suggested that there is heightened connectivity in our brain for days after reading a novel. So the effect doesn't go away once we complete the task of reading. The effect lasts for days. So obviously there are implications here about how we can engage people and engage them in our research, engage them in learning and teaching, engage them in pedagogy by turning to the arts, and that in fact the arts impact people and make an imprint in a way that nothing else does. So after discovering arts-based research, which certainly I didn't invent, people have been doing it for decades, and the term was coined in the early 90s by Elliot Eisner and Tom Barone, but I discovered that it existed. So after I discovered arts-based research existed, it immediately made sense to me. I know from my own life experience, I knew from my early teaching experiences that the arts can get through and reach people in a way nothing else can. I knew that somebody like my mother with a very different education, different first language experience, I knew that she could enjoy the arts and learn from them just as a scholar could. And so arts-based research immediately appealed to me, and I turned to fiction in my own work. The reason I turned to fiction is because I had loved writing since I was a child, and I had been very involved in creative writing since I was a child. And even though it's not what I decided to do as a career, although now it's sort of turned out that way, it made sense to me as a place to try to do this kind of work. And so I took what I had learned over nearly a decade from my interview research with women. I took my cumulative insights, I took some of the things and the feelings that had never made their way into journal articles or conference presentations because those forms didn't allow it, and I wrote my first novel. And that novel is called Low Fat Love. This is actually an anniversary edition that we put out a few years ago. But I wrote this novel called Low Fat Love, and Low Fat Love explores women settling in life and love because they don't believe that they can have what they really want. And they don't believe that they are worthy. So it looks at self-esteem issues, unhealthy relationship patterns, what some people might call toxic relationships, both romantic, but also in the workplace, family relationships, and so on and so forth. And actually, when I started writing Low Fat Love, I had no intention of writing a novel. I was on a sabbatical and I wanted to do this creative writing and see if I could take my research insights and put it into fiction. But I thought I would just write a short story and see how that went. And it just sort of became a bigger project. I didn't even know if I would publish it at the time. I was really doing it for myself as an experiment. And by the time I was done, I decided that I did in fact want to publish it. And I wanted to publish it as fiction, but also as research. So I ultimately published it with an academic publisher. But it was the response to Low Fat Love that really taught me about the power of arts-based research. And so that's what I want to share with you. And I just want to begin by saying that Low Fat Love, in my opinion, is a mediocre novel at best. It is not great. So the reaction to it is not because it's great or because I have some talent that you don't have. You can do what I did or your own version of what I did, whether it's using fiction or a different art form, if you choose to. I didn't know anything about writing a novel. I didn't have any experience doing it. And like I said, I don't think it's particularly great. It was the best I was able to do at that time. And I think my subsequent novels, each one has gotten better. And hopefully what I'll be doing 10 years from now, if I'm lucky to still be doing it, will be better than what I'm doing now. So that is a process that we all go on, where it's a learning process. And so I really encourage people to begin from where they are, like I did. But when Low Fat Love came out, I ended up becoming very lucky, and the book became quite successful, and people were reading it both inside the academy, but also outside of the academy. So I had finally done what I was always wanting to do, which was to have my work reach public audiences, to reach the kind of women I had been interviewing over the years. And the response to the novel was so strong. I just want to tell you a little bit about it. Everywhere I went, I was bombarded by readers. I've received countless emails. The book's been out for almost 10 years. I still receive emails about it from readers. But at the time, I was absolutely inundated with emails. Everywhere I went to do a book event or to speak at a conference, readers would stand in line and wait to whisper their own story to me. And that's my point. They wanted to whisper their own story of low-fat love and what that meant in their life. Some people told me about their alcoholism or domestic violence they experienced, or depression, suicide attempts, loneliness, just feelings of loneliness. There was a range of experiences. But through all of this and through people sharing their stories with me, I realized that the novel became a springboard for people to reflect on their own lives. And that was incredibly powerful. And some of the things that readers said to me were, "You made me care about regular people." So that showed me the power of arts-based research to build empathy, and to build empathy across differences, and to have people actually start to really see one another. Another thing that people frequently said to me was, "You wrote my life." I actually had one very funny experience. I was still teaching at the time. It was before I left the academy to write full time. I was teaching and I used Low Fat Love in one of my classes. And the day I went into the class to teach it, they were all sort of sitting there quietly staring at me. And my class was usually boisterous. I'd usually walk in and they'd all be chatting with each other and they'd chat with me. And they all sat there frozen. And I thought, like, oh my God, like at first I thought, is there something on my face? Or then I thought they hated the book. So I asked them, what is it? What's going on? And one of them looked at me and said, "We just can't believe you wrote this. It's like you wrote our lives." And I thought that was such an amazing, amazing remark that shows you how people can identify with a piece of art that, I promise you, there is no nonfiction academic writing that people will connect with in that way. By the time I released Low Fat Love, I had probably published about 10 nonfiction books and many articles. So I'm not coming to this without experience of knowing what the reaction to that work is like in comparison to the novel. And actually something funny happened that day after class. I had a student come to see me in my office, and she looked at me and she looked kind of upset. And I was like, "What is it?" And she said, "Is the book about me?" And I looked at her and I said, "I don't even know you. I don't know anything about your life. Like, I know your name and I know you're in my class." And then she felt silly, and I felt bad. I didn't want her to feel embarrassed, but it obviously resonated with her. And that's something arts-based research can do, whether it's a song or a play or a novel. If it connects with the person consuming it or experiencing it, it will resonate in a way that traditional academic writing rarely, if ever, does. So after writing Low Fat Love and seeing the response to it, I was completely hooked on writing fiction as a research practice. And so I've been writing novels and short stories ever since. And I just want to tell you very briefly about my most recent novel, which I think might be of interest to some of the people who are watching this today. My most recent novel is called Shooting Stars. And this one is actually my favorite of all of my books, and only came out about a month or two ago. But Shooting Stars explores how love in all its forms, so between lovers, friends, family, love of work, love of country, love of art, love in its many different forms can help people heal from past trauma, from abuse, can help them cope with grief. So how love can help us deal with these really serious topics that are hard to navigate in our lives. And I have to say, this is another example that when I released this book, and at this point I'd expected it, with Low Fat Love, I had not anticipated it, but with this, I expected it, especially given the topic. And while it's actually a very happy and optimistic book in the end, there are some really challenging, rough parts in the book that you have to get through. Some difficult things that could certainly be triggers for some readers who have experienced abuse in their lives and real trauma when they were growing up. So I was, again, inundated with messages. I've gotten messages on Facebook and through my email. I haven't been able to do any in-person events, but I have been Zooming and Skyping into book clubs who have been generous enough to read the book. And I can't tell you, it's another situation of people using the book to reflect on their own lives. And some people have messaged me messages about really severe trauma or abuse or sexual assault that they have lived through in their lives. Some people, I've had elderly people email me about abuse they experienced as a child in their family, where the abuser was a family member. Some of these people have told me they have never shared this with anyone, and that this happened like 60 years earlier in their life. And after reading the novel, they wanted to say this to somebody. And so they've chosen me to say it to. Many other readers haven't had any of the experiences, or not in the profound way that the characters in the book have, but it still resonated with them. I had one woman email me and tell me that she will forever speak with her husband differently, that she can't relate personally to what the characters in this book went through, but the way they all treat each other and enact love on a daily basis, the way they are gentle with each other, both the friends and lovers in this book, they treat each other with incredible grace. I wanted to put a model out in the world of how people who love and care about each other could treat each other that is wholly positive. And this woman, who I've never met, messaged me to tell me that it has forever changed the way she thinks about speaking to her husband and interacting with her husband, and that they've been married for over 20 years. And I thought that was incredibly powerful. But again, it shows the ability of the arts and of arts-based research to reach people on deep emotional levels, to resonate, to make people reflect on their own lives, to make people reflect and raise awareness about social issues that are happening. And so for me in my own work, it's been incredibly powerful. So I wanted to give you some examples, not from my own work, but from published arts-based research in the field of health studies, because I know that many of you who are coming to this event today are particularly interested in health research or come from a health research background. And I think when we think about arts-based research, we must think it appeals more to people who are in the humanities and those sorts of areas. But in truth, people in all fields are using arts-based research. I know neuroscientists who are using arts-based research, people who are using it across the natural or so-called hard sciences, as well as the social sciences and humanities, and also education and healthcare. So I do want to give you a few examples of how folks have used it in healthcare. If you're interested in learning more about these examples, you can look at either Method Meets Art, or you can look at the Handbook of Arts-Based Research, which I don't want to take credit for this book. The president was very kind to mention it. I'm the editor, but it's the contributors who are really amazing. And we have contributors in the natural sciences, healthcare, education, you name it. So you can learn more by looking at those resources, but a couple of examples. So the first example I'm going to give you is from visual art. And there is a project that is called the 7,024th patient. 7,024th patient. Why is that a tongue twister? And this was a project that folks in multiple disciplines engaged in, and it was led by principal investigator Jennifer L. Lapham. And basically, this is based on a study about patients' experiences of open heart surgery and recovery, which had previously been published in a traditional academic format. But when the researchers published it in a traditional academic format, they realized that people like their patients and their patients' caregivers would never have access to that research. So how could they show what the experience of open heart surgery is like for patients and for the loved ones who are taking care of those people after surgery? How could they share that with the public? How could they share that with healthcare practitioners who might not be involved in post-care? So people who are just involved in leading up to the surgery and then the surgery, but don't really necessarily fully understand what patients go through after that, what their caregivers go through after that, what life looks like after that. So they wanted to share all of this. So they created an incredible, which I've actually seen it in person. I've been very fortunate to see it in person, but they created an incredible large-scale installation, a visual art installation. It was 1,700 square feet and 9.5 feet tall. So just sort of think about that. It fills up a room, okay? 1,700 square feet and 9.5 feet tall. And Lapham describes the concept as follows. So I will read her description. A labyrinth pattern was chosen as the installation's concept, through which viewers would follow the patient's journey into the iconic center of the body, the heart, and the patient experience, the operating room. To date, the installation has been viewed at 2 hospitals, a Canadian Cardiovascular Congress, and an International Qualitative Inquiry Congress, where I had the pleasure of seeing it firsthand. And it really is this amazing labyrinth that you walk through. It's like walking through a maze. And there is visual artwork, and there are textual descriptions as well that shares what the patient's experience is like and what the caregiving experience is like. And it's extremely powerful. And at this point, it has been viewed thousands of times by relevant stakeholders. So including healthcare providers, patients, and educators. So that's an example in healthcare research of using visual art to represent research that had already been represented in a traditional peer-reviewed format. I also want to give you some healthcare examples from theater. And theater has become a really big area for health research in arts-based research. So we call it health theater. And people call it different things, but generally arts-based researchers refer to it as health theater. And there is a Canadian scholar named Jeff Nisker who has really been active in advocating for and conducting health research as a means of engaging the public in healthcare and medical ethical issues. So the whole purpose of doing it is to engage the public, which I know is of interest to many of you. So researchers are actively drawing on the potential of the dramatic arts to engage and inform people in order to involve different stakeholders in the development of health policy. So Jeff Nisker writes this. He writes, theatrical productions focusing on the persons at the center of a healthcare issue can bring all who ought to be responsible for its policy development. For example, patients, their family members, the general public, health professionals, to a better understanding of the new scientific possibilities, ethical issues, and most important, the persons immersed therein. So the idea of doing healthcare, health theater is to bring in multiple stakeholders into the process to learn more, to be involved in policy development, to understand issues that are moving forward, such as medical ethical issues. So I want to give you a couple of different examples of how scholars have used health theater in their own work. So one example I love is there's a group called Collection Disruption. It's a Canadian research ensemble led by a scholar named Julia Gray, who works out of Toronto. And they've created many different plays. One of the shows they've created is called Cracked, New Light on Dementia. And it explores living with and caring for those with dementia. And obviously they can bring relevant stakeholders into their audiences when they screen at community theaters and at colleges and universities. When they show this production, they can bring in those stakeholders to participate. I'll give you another example. With funding from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and Health Canada, Jeff Nisker, who I mentioned earlier, has written multiple plays which have been performed widely across Canada, one of which is called Sarah's Daughters, which is about predictive genetic testing. And the goal was to educate the public about this ethical issue so that they could be involved in deciding protocols moving forward. He wrote another play called Orchids, which is about testing in vitro embryos for genetic markers. Again, another ethical issue, and he wanted to bring relevant stakeholders, including the public, into that discourse? And how do you educate the public about these really complicated medical issues? Theater is one such way. So what I really want to leave you with is talking briefly about the promise of arts-based research, which is something I'm hoping that you've been gleaning during this discussion. And really, to me, one of the biggest promises of arts-based research is that we can engage multiple audiences. We can engage public audiences with research. And that can be with the products of research, or also inviting them to participate in the research inquiry, in the entire research inquiry. Another promise of arts-based research is reaching people on deep emotional levels, creating resonance, promoting deep engagement, promoting lasting learning. So as opposed to a journal article, which no one in the public would read anyway, but even if you're an academic and you read a journal article, usually we read it, we might highlight, take a few notes, use it in our own research, but we can't necessarily recall that journal article a week later, a year later, 10 years later. But a movie we enjoy, a play we enjoy, a novel we enjoy. And even if we don't enjoy it per se, if it struck us, if it's memorable, if it in any way resonates, that creates deep and lasting impressions. Like I said, Low Fat Love came out almost 10 years ago, and to this day, I still get emails about it. Some of those emails are from people who read it when it first came out, but they still think about it in their own lives. And it's not a particularly great novel, but it was very honest and raw, and I do think it gave voice to something that we don't always give voice to. And so for that reason, it got through to people. And the reason I keep telling you it's not a great novel is because I want you to understand that you can build the skills you need to do this, but you need to begin from where you are. Arts-based research is available to everybody. And I strongly, strongly encourage those who are interested in engaging with arts-based research to simply begin from where you are and understand that if you continue in that area, you will get better over time. You will develop new skills like we all do when we practice anything over time. But I don't want to discourage you from starting where you are. And so what I want to leave you with is a handout that for me is really meant as an invitation to all of you if you're interested in getting started on arts-based research. So this handout, it's a two-sided handout that has been made available to all of you and will continue to be made available to you online. So if you don't have it yet, you don't have to worry about it. And I'm not going to read through the whole handout, but I just want to tell you a little bit about what it is. It's a handout I developed on writing prompts because I don't know what artistic background or artistic skill or artistic training some of you might have. Some of you might have some in music and visual art. Some of you might have none, but you can all write something. So for those people who might be nervous about engaging in arts-based research, I think that writing, whether it's creative nonfiction or it becomes fiction or it becomes writing a play, whatever it is, I think writing is a great place to begin. Of course, if you already have some sort of arts practice, you can start from there, and that's terrific. But if you don't have an arts practice, you might want to begin with writing. And so I've given you an example. Writing prompts are just meant to start you writing. It's meant to get you, give you an idea where then you can just free write and creative write. So I've explained a little bit about what a writing prompt is. I've given you an example from research that I've conducted. And then you'll see on the back, you can fill it in yourself if you choose to. Whether you're doing research or you're doing something based on your personal experience or your own community, your own family, there are options here for all of you to create different writing prompts. They don't have to be great, they don't have to be brilliant. And then after you create the writing prompts, you'll end up with a whole list of them. Pick one, just pick the one that stands out to you and just start free writing. Don't censor yourself. Don't worry about if it's any good. It doesn't matter. Just start free writing. You might be writing a fictional story about a make-believe person. You might be writing about somebody you know. You might be writing about a cumulative insight you have from research you've conducted. And so it's sort of a composite character, but just free write and use that as a place to begin your arts-based research experience. And so I really want to thank the university again for having me here. And I'm looking forward to, we're going to do a Q&A now, which I'm very happy to respond to any questions or comments. But I just want to leave you with this final thought that arts-based research is available to all of us, and the products of arts-based research can be made available to everyone else, so can be made available to the public. And so I strongly encourage you, if you're at all interested in this, to just begin from where you are. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm going to turn it over to Helen to moderate our discussion.
Patricia, thank you so much for that really inspirational presentation. You know, I couldn't help thinking as you were talking that for most of us who become involved in research, you know, the decision to do that is motivated as much by a passion, if I could even say a love for what we do. You know, it's very often as much an emotional and an effective life choice as it is a cognitive one. And it was just so refreshing for me to hear the vocabulary of research expanded from, you know, the kind of language we often hear of excellence and of funding and of quartiles, all of which are tremendously important, but to see that expanded to include empathy and resonance and creativity. So I really appreciated that. We have a number of really wonderful and in-depth questions here. Just there's a practical question there about how we can gain access to the handout that Patricia had mentioned. So I just want to let attendees know that that is available on the Eventbrite site. So, and if you have any problems, just contact us there. Patricia, just a couple of the questions coming in here. There's one question about the impact of trauma on the use of arts. And this is a question coming in from a researcher who is working with migrant communities. And those of us, you know, for example, who work in music know that, of course, music can be a trigger with some vulnerable communities. And the question that's coming in from this person is that his experience is the people that he is working with sometimes have a deep suspicion of the use of their music and that being framed as research. I wonder if that's something that you've come across or that you might have some insights about.
It's a fascinating question. And look, all research is going to come with a range of ethical issues. And so certainly that's true for arts-based research. And we have to navigate those, I think, on a project by project basis in many ways. And while there are some ethical guidelines that we should always follow, you know, obviously participation should be voluntary and those kinds of things, depending on the nature of the research we're doing, there are also special considerations. And the last thing you ever want is for your research participants to feel like you are taking something that is theirs and appropriating it for your own purposes. So it could be music, it could be art, it could be something else. I mean, this can happen in many different kinds of research. This can happen in community-based research where art is not used. And you don't want a situation in which people feel, and if they feel that way, it's legitimate. If they feel that way, then it is what is happening because in their mind it is. And at the end of the day, that's what matters. So I would say there are a few options. Certainly if your participants feel that way, I wouldn't continue with the research. I would adapt. So different things you can try. First of all, explaining your intentions and explaining them in simple, clear language that your participants will relate to and understand, and obviously completely honestly. So you need to make sure, and sometimes, you know, we think about informed consent, where we've given our participants a description of our research, they've signed it, and we feel like we're done. But really, that doesn't mean they fully understand the research. You know, there are some scholars who talk about processing consent, which means checking in over the course of the research to make sure consent is still understood. So one thing is to explain why you want to use the art, your intention for using it, and a discussion where they understand that they can be honest and open about how they feel about that. Another issue could be co-authorship, that you are no longer the sole author of this, but if you are using their art from their culture, that you want them to be a co-author. And many scholars do this, and many arts-based researchers do this, that they make their participants co-authors if they are, you know, for any number of reasons, but this would be one example where they are making them co-authors. Another example would be to, well, obviously just to not use the music if that is in any way offensive to them, but to ask them for an alternative. Say, this was what I was planning to do, or what I was interested in doing because I thought it might be helpful this way. I'm now hearing from you that this raises concerns. Can you suggest an alternative? And we often don't do that. We don't think our participants can help formulate the research purpose, the research questions, and the methodology for proceeding, but they can. And that's what participatory research is really about. And while I didn't talk about it today, I have written quite a bit about participatory research. And really, in my estimation, the best, most effective participatory research is when we involve our participants in all aspects. So it's not just about us as the researchers coming in and saying, I'd like to do this and use this part of your culture in this way, but it's saying to them, what do you think we should do? What do you think would get across to people like you in your community who we hope to help with this research? So those are a few suggestions, but I do understand, I hear the comment. I mean, there are always these ethical issues, and you really have to trust yourself as a researcher, you know, what feels right to you. If it feels like exploitation to your participants, or they're implying or insinuating it does, you do need to pause. And you do need to reflect on, how can I make this more collaborative and more participatory in a way that they feel empowered by it and they don't feel exploited by it.
Thank you, Patricia. That's really helpful. And I know one of the kind of the cornerstones of participatory research, isn't it? It's that commitment to participation right from the beginning of the research process. And this is a really interesting space for the arts, I think. There's a question here, Patricia, which I think probably many of us who work in the arts have come across before, and it has to do with how, you know, qualitative and arts-based research methods can answer to the demands of the more objective, empirical research agenda. And I might just read this out. I'm interested in hearing more about what Professor Leavy thinks about how to marry the role of ABR in promoting empathy and disrupting dominant ideas with the need for scientific evidence. And there's an example included. I taught medical students a module on arts and health, and I was demonstrated how we understand the person's lived experience of dementia through film and novels, etc. One dissenting student spoke up and said, I'd rather read a scientific report detailing evidence-based statistics about dementia symptoms than watch a film that may or may not be accurate. How do we answer to these kinds of, which again, as I said, are probably perspectives many of us have come across in this work?
Absolutely. But look, I mean, to be clear, every new research paradigm is met with scrutiny. And in some ways, that's a positive thing, because it forces you to think about things like evaluation criteria and all of that. I mean, just as an example from my own work, when I released the first edition of Method Meets Art in 2008, I don't think I had anything in the book about evaluation. There was nothing out there written, and I don't even think it occurred to me, honestly. And I was probably writing that book in around 2005, so about 15 years ago. And in the world of ABR, that was a lifetime ago. But the second and third edition both have chapters devoted to evaluation criteria, because experience has shown me that we need to have those because of questions like this, but also because we've been developing more criteria and seeing how we can apply those criteria. So, you know, we will continue to deal with this issue over a long period of time. Still to this day, qualitative research is often judged against quantitative research, which, you know, is a mistake, because there are different paradigms, and so there are different methods, and therefore you need different evaluation criteria. So I will say, this is not my response, I will give the response after, but I will say the whole idea of evidence-based is very loaded itself. And so I'm sure many of us watching this, and perhaps even the person who asked the question, realize it's a loaded term, because what counts as evidence? You know, it's not only positivist or post-positive work that counts as evidence. And I'm in no way anti-quantitative research. I've used it, I've written about it. The president mentioned earlier my book, Research Design. It compares 5 approaches to research, and it just compares what they do, the strengths of each one. There's nothing negative. They're useful for different things. So I wrote extensively about quantitative research in this book. In fact, it is the first methods chapter in that book. So I'm not against any particular paradigm. I happen to do more arts-based research, but I think all paradigms are useful and have their place. They can answer certain questions. But the idea of what counts as evidence, I mean, the student who would raise that question in a class has already been socialized into thinking that empirical research means quantitative research, when in fact I would argue that qualitative research and arts-based research can absolutely be empirical as well. It's a different kind of evidence. In-depth interview is open-ended and qualitative, but that is evidence. I mean, that transcript is actually data. That is evidence. And so the whole idea of evidence-based is problematic. That being said, I know that these are realities that we all have to negotiate. And I would say that there is a big range with arts-based research. Some arts-based research is built directly out of quantitative or qualitative research. For example, there are some plays. I talked about health research, but there are plays in the field of education that have been written based on census data and survey research. So the evidence is actually implanted in the play. And if you learn how to write an ethnodrama, if you actually study that the same way you would learn how to design an experiment or learn how to design an interview study, if you learn how to design it, then the data will be in that play. So it's not quite the same thing as seeing a play that's for the general public that was created only as a piece of art. If it's arts-based research, it was created with a research intention, and therefore it is grounded in research. So the data is actually there. Data has been generated, and it is there. So evidence is there. Now, I understand that people still perceive it differently, but it's interesting to me because a survey, for example, which is quantitative, is really only as good as the questions you ask, the instrument you end up with. And there is humanness that goes into creating that instrument. You can't avoid it. The same with an experimental protocol. And again, I'm not for or against any of this, but human beings create all of these things. And so there are biases, if you want to call them that, implicit in all forms of research. So if I'm going to create a survey, which I actually have done survey research, there will be biases just based on the questions I ask. It can't be avoided. And if I write a novel, it comes through my filter as well. And so I fully acknowledge that there are biases, meaning it comes through my worldview. So I would say for those folks out there who want to do this research, but also need to meet certain criteria at their university or institution or the medical facility they work at, one thing arts-based researchers often do is publish in two different forms. So the Jennifer Lapham example I gave you with the visual art installation, that was published in peer-reviewed journal articles in health and in education, and it was also presented as an artistic display. So that is something you might want to do. I actually often present my research in more than one form. So most of what I've done in my novels, I have also shared in conference presentations, in peer-reviewed journal articles, or sometimes in op-eds and blogs. So those aren't academic, but they're meant for a different audience. So your research might have more than one outcome. So that's one way that people negotiate that. And another way is through the citation system. I don't actually love the academic citation system and how we just, cite a bunch of people and somehow that makes our work more valid. However, we can use that. We can exploit it to our benefit. And in particular, graduate students, I always get questions from people who want to do a thesis or a dissertation about how their work will be perceived and will it be perceived as legitimate. And what I always recommend to them is cite, cite, cite. There is nothing I've spoken about today that hundreds and in some cases thousands and thousands of scholars around the world haven't done. I'm not the only one doing this research. There are thousands of people doing this research in lots of different disciplines and they've published about it. So cite, 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 the same way you would in qualitative research or quantitative research. And that can also lend that credibility that those of us jumping hoops in academia need to do sometimes.
Thank you so much, Patricia. And breaking news for everybody, our wonderful Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences librarian, Patty Punch, has just informed us that as well as having the hard copies of Patricia's books, which we have, the e-copies are also available. So go out there and follow up on this. There's a few questions here, Patricia, that I think are related to each other. And they have to do with when we cross the line from ethnodrama, ethnography, narrative inquiry into fiction. That crossing of that threshold. There's questions here about the ethics of that? You know, if participants start working with us, at what point do we, you know, engage with them in terms of this becoming a creative output? Do people have any reservations about that in your experience, when people's understanding of research maybe is challenged by that? And the line between fictional work and ethnographic work?
Great questions. And these are questions I get asked a lot, obviously, because I write novels that are based on my research. So a couple of answers. The first thing is, I think that when you publish your research, you have to present it as a work of fiction if it is a work of fiction. So, I mean, I present my work as fiction. So I don't try to present it otherwise. And while I do talk about how it is loosely based on my research, or in some cases deeply based on my research, I always present it as fiction. I always label my books novels. I always talk about that there was imaginative writing that went into it, that these situations did not occur. So I think it's very important, and we should always present our work honestly. So it doesn't just have to be fiction. All research should be presented honestly, which is actually something we don't talk about as much as we should. And it becomes very obvious to people when we talk about fiction, because it seems so far left of what is the. We should always do that. So one thing you should do is to label your work accurately. So I label my work fiction, I label it novels. The question about participants is hugely important, and I've thought about that a lot over the years. When I wrote my first novel, Low Fat Love, I had no idea that I was going to write a novel. So I had done interview research for about 9 years, lots of different projects. And then when I wrote Low Fat Love, it was based on cumulative insights. So no one person in any way, truly, but cumulative insights. Now, I had never mentioned to any of those people that I might fictionalize this work, because I truly didn't know. It had never occurred to me that I would. So, and I did think about that. However, because it wasn't even based on one study, it was based on my entire career and cumulative experiences, and it was completely fictionalized. The characters are completely composites that are created from my imagination. I ultimately felt fine with that and felt that, you know, it's not how I would do it the next time, but I felt okay doing it that time because it was the best I could do. It was either that or not publish it. And I felt that the greater good was served by publishing that. And I still do. I can look back 10 years and I feel the greater good in that case was actually by publishing it and by reaching particularly women who I think have benefited from it. However, my experience with Low Fat Love taught me that you never know what you're going to do with your research findings. So ever since then, every time I've done any research with participants, my informed consent has included a range of artistic possibilities, including fictionalizing their work. It's included popularizing their work, blogs, websites, op-eds, just a whole lot of things I never thought of. It even includes artistic forms that I don't do, just in case. Because I've now learned, you know, we all grow and evolve, and I don't ever want to have to question again, did they know I might do this? So now I tell everyone very explicitly up front that these are the different possibilities for how I might use this. And I do include peer-reviewed journal articles, conference presentations, and I'm also explicit in my informed consent that it could be any or all of these. And I tell them the truth, that I don't know. Because I don't know now. I've learned I don't know. I've learned that even if you have a plan, you might realize there's a greater good served by a different plan. So for example, I did an interview study. I did the research, gosh, I don't remember how many years ago. I'd say a little more than 5 years ago, maybe 6, 7 years ago. I did qualitative interviews. And actually I did these by email, which I had never done in my life. So they were written interviews. And the reason I did written interviews is because I wanted to reach women across the United States, living in very different kinds of communities with different backgrounds, different racial and ethnic backgrounds, economic, education, ages. And there was just no way to do that in person. So the only way to do it was written interviews. So I did this study. I forget exactly how many interviews, but like around 70. The women ranged in age from around 20 to around 80. So it was a wide range. And I was intending at the time to write a nonfiction book, like a monograph. And I even had a book contract to write a monograph about this research. But in my informed consent, I put a million things. I could fictionalize it. I could write a blog. Because I knew that I don't know. Well, I'll save you from the whole story, but the bottom line is I was not able to write that nonfiction book. And I'm a pretty prolific author. I've written more than 30 books in less than 20 years. So I don't get a lot of writer's block. I mean, I can write 7 days a week, but every time I went to sit down to write this book, I was completely stuck. And I realized ultimately that it was because at that point I had been writing novels for years, and that there was something about this very academic format that I felt was not capturing these women's stories. So I ended up partnering with a creative arts therapist, and she did visual representations of the interviews based on the themes in the interviews. Then I wrote a first-person short story based directly on the interview transcript, so like verbatim transcript. And then she did a final portrait of the woman's story, not meant to be what the woman looks like. We didn't even know what they look like. We never met them, but to what the story evokes, what the story's about. And so we ended up co-authoring this book. She did the visual art, I did the writing, but we called it co-authorship. And it's called Low Fat Love Stories, because it was inspired by the response to my novel, Low Fat Love. And we put that book out. Now, in my informed consent, I had actually included visual art, which I had no way of knowing at the time I would ever do. But because I learned from my first novel that you just don't know what you don't know, I now have very broad informed consent, and not broad as in vague, but broad as in detailed. So I suggest that if you are in any way thinking that you might ever want to popularize your research through op-eds, blogs, radio, you might want to use the arts in any form, including cross-pollination, collaborating with someone who has an artistic skill that maybe you don't have, include it all in your informed consent. And as to the question of whether or not that has ever bothered participants, I could actually say not once ever. And which is interesting. I mean, I have had participants over the years that didn't want to participate in traditional research, or chose not to, people I tried to recruit who did not want to participate. Nobody has ever said anything about the art. And the reason is, I actually think that they understand it. Because you know what? Most people you interview, they can't relate to what a peer-reviewed journal article is. I mean, unless you're interviewing your colleagues, they don't know what it is. So they just sort of go along with you that that's like how research proceeds. But everybody knows what a short story is, or what a creative nonfiction essay is, or what a blog is. And so they can actually see how their work would reach people like them. So I've actually had the opposite experience. You do get pushback in the academy, which is the beginning of the question. So yes, you will find pushback there, certainly, not from everyone, but there will be segments who you will certainly get pushback. But in my experience, not from the participants at all, because they can actually relate to it. And it's a wonderful thing to have a participant say, my daughter can read this research. My husband can read this research. My coworker can read this research, which never in the case of writing a journal article has any participant ever told me, I'm going to share this with my family. So that's actually been very positive for me.
That's wonderful. My takeaway line from that, Patricia, and I'm going to use this as a great definition of research, is you just don't know what you don't know. We're beginning to draw to a close. I'm just going to do one final question. I mean, it strikes me that so much of what you're talking about here really is about relationship. It's about co-design, it's about collaboration. And we have maybe a final question here in terms of participatory research. It'd be interesting to hear your ideas about using arts-based research to build relationship, to set research priorities together. Could we maybe finish with a few words about that question about building relationship in participatory research?
Absolutely. And I think the arts are a uniquely good way to do that, because everybody has access to them. And what you realize when you start doing research is that even if the participants are at first maybe a little nervous because they don't think of themselves as artistic, the reality is that almost everybody grew up with crayons drawing. Almost everyone grew up with coloring books. Almost everyone grew up singing songs. Almost everyone grew up doing some of these creative things. And most adults now consume or experience the arts on a regular basis. It's very rare you'll meet someone who doesn't love music. Most people love music. Most people listen to music every day. It's the first thing I do when I wake up in the morning. I put the music on, and I don't think I'm alone. I think a lot of people live that way. So bringing the arts in early on is a fantastic idea for participatory research. One thing I would suggest is it's really important to think of the kind of art you bring in, that it should not be intimidating. to anyone. It shouldn't be intimidating to people from different backgrounds, for people who don't think of themselves as artistic. If there are any language challenges, language barriers, you need to think about all of that. So one way that researchers often will use collage to sort of develop relationships with participants and to initially build a study, because collage is something anybody can do. I mean, a 5-year-old can do collage. And you just provide whatever you want to provide: magazine images, newspaper bits, colored paper, construction paper, white paper, magic markers, pens, pencils. It doesn't matter what it is, something to adhere the thing. So glue, tape, whatever. And come up with some guideline for, using these materials, create a collage that represents this topic to you. So the topic that you ultimately all want to explore. Have everyone create a collage, then go around in a circle. What does your collage mean to you? What will come out of this is people's perspective on the topic that you actually want to research. But anyone can make a collage. It's a simple thing to do. Another thing would be creative writing. And you can actually use some of the prompts that I've given you with participants, and you can just alter them a bit. But this would be an easy way if writing is not outside of the bounds of what everyone can do. If literacy is not an issue with the group and everyone can write, you could use a little bit of creative writing. But it's a great way, or you could just bring in art as a prompt as well, which isn't necessarily arts-based research. It's more like photo elicitation or something like that. But you could bring in photographs, or ask everyone else to bring in photographs, or ask everyone to take a photograph. These days, most people have a telephone where they can easily take a photograph and bring it and share it. Have people take a photograph of whatever this topic is in their own life, and then bring it in and talk about it. And I do want to just give you very quickly one example from published research. Now, this isn't about creating the research problem together. This was actually during data collection, but it might sort of get you thinking about this. And it's an example I use in Method Meets Art, and it's always been one of my favorite examples. There was a research team that wanted to study how high school kids feel in their schools and how they look at school as a place to be. And so they decided to do participatory art. So they went into the schools, they gave the kids lots of different art supplies, and they told them all different kinds of mediums they could use, virtually whatever they wanted, to create a piece of art that represented how they feel in their school. One of the participants, a high school girl, created a portrait of herself that was cropped very closely around her face. The interviewers, the researchers, then asked each of the participants, I believe privately, so they had some privacy, to discuss the art they made. This girl said that she created that image to show how closed in and boxed in she feels in her school. The researchers said, based on the questions they had, this data would never have come out without the art component to their research. So ultimately, because they had the participants create art and then discuss the art, they got at data that they might otherwise never have gotten at. So it just shows you, if you engage people in making art, creating art, writing, whatever it might be, that things might come up that might not otherwise come up. And I will just throw one more thing out there, that we often don't realize how educated we are in comparison to the majority of people in the world. If you work in a university setting, if you work in a research institute, if you work in facilities like this, everybody around you has the kind of education that you have. And so we often take it for granted. But to people outside of the academy or outside of research institutes, the kind of education we have can be very intimidating. And it can seem like we have knowledge that they don't have, even though they might really be the experts, because it's something about their lives that we're interested in studying. So a beautiful thing about the arts is it really democratizes knowledge building, because you don't need to have a PhD to create a collage. You don't need to have a medical degree to create a portrait of yourself, or bring in your favorite song, or take a photograph of your community. And that can be very empowering to your participants, where they might be able to share and hence develop the project with you in a way that would otherwise be impossible.
Patricia, thank you so much. And in fact, you've answered one of the other questions there, which was about how this paradigm works with young people. So that was a wonderful, wonderful example. I can't think of a better way to really start this series of events and conversations around, how it is that we can collaboratively work together to produce the kind of research that can have an impact in our world. I can't think of a more important time to be asking these questions, you know, the ethical questions that you're asking about the role of research in the world that we live in, the role of creativity and imagination, and, you know, how that can feed our resilience and our adventurous spirits in this time when, you know, there's a lot of fear and anxiety in the world. So I think the value of this conversation for us in the cluster is immense, but goes well beyond that as well. So I truly want to thank you for that. And saying goodbye to all our attendees today, I just would like to let you know that Patricia's presentation today has been recorded. It will be available for 2 weeks if you want to dip back into this again. And the presentation is also available through the Eventbrite link. I'd just like to finish by drawing your attention to our next event, which will take place on the 14th of November. This is called Singing with the Voices of the World. And this is a day of online workshops in singing, health, and working with global voices. As I said, our arts-based method within our cluster primarily works through singing and music in the context of cultural diversity. The day features a number of presentations from international organizations, including Musicians Without Borders, Sing Up UK, the American Institute of Music and Healing, as well as the well-known Irish conductor and media personality, David Brophy. So I'd like to finish by again thanking the University of Limerick President, Kerstin Mey, and our inspirational presenter today, Professor Patricia Leavy, and to all of you who joined us today to learn about the promise and the power of arts-based research. Stay well, stay safe, and thank you for sharing your time with us today.